Hello my friends and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier list and guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're continuing to look at the level 1 spells. In part 1 of this video we looked at the first half of the 52 level 1 spells, so we're going to continue and look at the remaining 26. I've already gone over the rating system and the definitions of the tiers in part 1, so we won't repeat that, but before I begin, I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to Radu Trendafir for the $25 donation, Eris Box for the $5, Dark Quaz for the 2,500 yen, and Carlo and Sean Swafford for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really appreciate the support. It really means a lot to me. All right, let's dive right back in. First up, we're going to talk about Grease. Grease is a non-concentration battlefield control spell, and any control spell, especially an AoE spell that's not concentration, is always going to be pretty interesting. It's a 13-foot radius surface where when you cast it, everything inside it immediately has to make a dexterity save or fall prone, and if enemies walk in the surface, or characters in general walk in the surface, it's difficult terrain, so they move at half speed, and they again have to make a dex save or fall prone. Just like we talked about with Chromatic Orb, when you create a surface where enemies can fall prone when they walk on it in Baldur's Gate, it's incredible crowd control, because when an enemy falls prone on their turn, they lose the rest of their turn. Most enemies move before doing their other actions, so you're very likely to get repeated stuns when you have a surface that enemies can slip and fall on. Grease is a pretty good way to produce this because it's a large radius, it uses your spell save DC, so it ends up being a very strong crowd control spell. By the way, the radius on the wiki right now says 17 feet, which is incorrect. It's 13 feet in-game, and that's at the actual radius of the spell. So at time of recording, there's an error on the wiki if you're following along there. A moderately large radius, non-concentration stun is obviously excellent, and also just by default knocking enemies prone by casting a spell on them and then they fall over is pretty good, because you can knock enemies prone and then make attacks with advantage with the rest of your party members against those now prone enemies. It's also a great way to interrupt concentration on spellcasters, because when they fall over they immediately lose concentration on their spells. So the effect of Grease is very, very strong. However, there are two things in Baldur's Gate that hold this spell back a little bit, or at least reduce the priority of this spell. The first is that it is somewhat redundant with bottles of grease. You can find bottles that create a grease surface and throw them, and then it creates a very similar surface. But the bottle has some key differences, so I think it doesn't entirely replace the spell. Firstly, it's a smaller radius, and when you reduce the radius of a circle, it decreases the area of that circle dramatically. So even small changes in radius mean it's much harder to hit lots of enemies in the spell. And secondly, when you use a bottle, it has a fixed save DC of 12, whereas when you cast the spell, it uses your spell save DC, so enemies that you hit with the spell are much more likely to fall over. So the existence of the bottle, sometimes you'll see people say that you don't need grease because those exist. I don't think they replace the spell. The bigger downside for grease is that it is flammable. When you hit any grease surface with fire, it turns into a fire surface. And the ability to accidentally just delete your spell that you spent a spell slot on is obviously pretty bad. Now, you'll have gotten the initial value of knocking enemies prone, and even if you cast it into a fire, it'll still knock enemies over and then set them on fire, which you can do on purpose as well. But usually you would prefer not to set the grease on fire, and it's very easy to accidentally do this and lose control of the battlefield as a result. A lot of enemies have random fire damage, a lot of arenas have random fires. It's very easy to cast it on a lit torch that you just didn't see and not get the full effect. So this spell is a little bit harder to use thanks to the fact that it's flammable. Nonetheless, it's such a powerful effect that you're still going to use it in a lot of fights, especially at early levels. An AoE non-concentration stun is just massive, so I'm going to give it A tier. It would be S tier if it wasn't flammable. Guiding Bolt. Guiding Bolt is a cleric damage spell. It's 60-foot range, targeting a single enemy, and you make an attack roll, so you roll against their armor class. If you hit, you do 4d6 radiant damage. 4d6 damage is an okay amount of damage for a first level spell. It's 14 average damage to a single target, which is decent. It's not incredible, but it's worth spending the spell slot on a decent amount of the time. And then also, the next attack against that target has advantage. The actual damage from the spell is reasonable and made a little more attractive because clerics don't have a lot of great options for direct damage in the early game. Although, now that they get Toll the Dead, clerics will often want to use a cantrip rather than a first level spell on doing direct damage to an enemy, so Guiding Bolt has become less attractive in that sense because you now just have a good ranged damage spell available on every cleric. But even so, there are times when you just need a little more punch, and Guiding Bolt will provide that. Radiant damage is also a relevant damage type. A lot of clerics are going to be using Radiating Orb stuff, so it's a great way to apply that as well. Advantage on your next attack roll against an enemy is also solid. Obviously, gaining advantage is good. The fact that it only works for one attack roll, though, is much less attractive because a lot of the time, the character that you would want to have advantage on their next attack can get that anyways. If they're a rogue, they can bonus action hide. You can move them into a darkened area or something like that. There's a lot of other ways to gain advantage on one attack or multiple attacks. So while Guiding Bolt's bonus is nice and definitely you will be happy to have it, it's not something that you're going to go wild over. That basically sums up the spell. This is a solid spell that you're never going to be sad to have. You will use it pretty frequently, but it's never going to be an all-star. It's more a filler action for when you don't have something better to do with your turn. Circle of the Star Druids also get Guiding Bolt, and they get free casts of Guiding Bolt. Now, they'll almost never prepare and cast this using their actual spell slots, but the free casts of Guiding Bolt from their class feature, they're going to use all the time. But as a spell, it's not particularly important to them. Guiding Bolt, I think, is another very classic B-tier spell. It is a great filler action for when you don't have anything better to do, so you're never sad to have it, but it's not something that really draws you to playing Cleric specifically. Hail of Thorns. Hail of Thorns is a ranger spell cast as part of making an attack roll, costs your bonus action, and the target of the attack and everyone within 7 feet of them takes a d10 of piercing damage with a dexterity saving throw for half. That's 1d10, so 5.5 average damage, and a dex save for half. You're spending your first level spell slot on this spell to do a tiny amount of damage, an extremely negligible amount of damage, in a very small radius with restricted targeting. And it takes your bonus action. It's obviously this spell is just terrible. It's a damage spell that does very little damage and is hard to use, D tier. Next up, Healing Word. Healing Word is the good healing spell. When Cure Wounds is having a bad day, which is most days, it lies awake at night thinking about Healing Word and wishing it had stayed in school. Healing Word is a 60-foot range bonus action that heals for 1d4 plus your spellcasting modifier. Being a ranged and a bonus action makes this spell actually usable as a healing spell in combat. There's 3 main uses for Healing Word. First is as a panic button. It's the best way to get a downed ally back on their feet. If an ally has been reduced to 0 hit points, Healing Word immediately gets them back into the fight. It only costs your bonus action. You don't have to reposition or anything. So it is the best way to revive an ally who has gone down in combat and continue the fight in your favor. The second is to apply buffs. In Baldur's Gate 3, the buff on heal items are extremely powerful. The Whispering Promise and the Hellrider's Pride can provide Bless and Blade Ward to your allies. Being able to apply those as a bonus action at range means that you can refresh those buffs in combat and not just have them for the first turn of combat by throwing a healing potion or something like that. So your character that's using those items can apply these extremely powerful buffs to your allies. It also, of course, benefits from any other bonuses to healing that you have. There's a lot of items that give you additional, extra healing on top of your default healing, class features like Life Cleric that benefit from an ally being healed, things like the Broodmother's Revenge ring that go off when a character is healed. Being able to trigger all of those effects as a bonus action is way better than triggering them with an action, and doing it at a 60-foot range means that you can do so pretty much no matter what the fight looks like. Finally, there is the last usage of the spell, and this is probably the least common, but still relevant, which is actually just using it as a healing spell to give your ally enough hit points to survive the next enemy attack. If an enemy is doing an average of 10 damage and your character has, 8 HP, sometimes it can be worth it to throw a healing word on them to make sure that they get their next turn. So pay attention to how much damage enemies are doing, and healing word can often buy you a whole extra turn with a character, even in a fight that's going badly. Any one of these uses is enough to make this a pretty powerful spell. All three of them together mean that Healing Word is just a spell that you should have in pretty much any party. Just makes your playthrough safer, smoother, and easier at any given time. You will try not to spend too many level 1 spell slots on Healing Word, because obviously a spell slot you're spending on Healing Word is one you're not spending on Command, for example. But this is still an extremely powerful spell. It just gets better as the game goes on, too, and level 1 spell slots become less important to your character. S tier for Healing Word. Next up, Hellish Rebuke. Hellish Rebuke is a Warlock damage spell that does 2d10 fire damage with a dexterity save for half, as a reaction when an enemy attacks you. 11 average damage with a dex save for half is obviously not a good ratio for a level 1 spell. That is a waste of a spell slot most of the time. But the fact that this spell doesn't cost you an action does make it more interesting. On the face of it, the damage is pretty poor, but since it happens on the enemy turn, if you kill an enemy on their turn, you can do something else with your next turn. And even better, if you kill an enemy that has multiple actions on their first action, they won't get a second action, and you'll actually gain action economy. So this spell can sometimes snowball the fight in your favor by getting you more effective turns. It's very expensive to do that, and fairly unlikely because the damage is so low, so the hit point totals have to line up pretty perfectly for Hellish Rebuke to actually end up gaining you actions, but when it does, it's pretty powerful. The real advantage of this spell, though, is that it has synergy with specific builds, which are builds based around retaliation. Armor of Agathis, also a Warlock spell, is a very powerful strategy, and Hellish Rebuke adds a nice amount of retaliation damage to that. There's also a couple bugs that you can abuse with Hellish Rebuke. Firstly, despite being a spell, it works while you're in Barbarian Rage. There's a couple spells that work while you're raging as a Barbarian. So if you're multiclassed with Barbarian and Warlock, Hellish Rebuke is a nice additional damage to a character combo that probably is going to be taking hits a lot. And also, if you react to a multi-attack or a spell with multiple parts like Magic Missile or Scorching Ray, the game will throw up the reaction in response to the first damage instance that you take, and then if you use Hellish Rebuke in response to that, the game just forgets that the rest of them exist. So if you Hellish Rebuke a Scorching Ray from an enemy, you eat all but the first Scorching Ray, so you can actually use this to delete parts of enemies' turns thanks to that bug. Between the ways that you can build around this with the sort of bugs that this spell has, and the fact that it has some synergy with specific builds, I think that it is a C tier spell. In terms of just ratio of damage output to spell slot, it's terrible, but there are enough cool things that you can do with it that sometimes you're going to want to use it anyways. Next up, Heroism. Heroism is a concentration-based buff spell, so you cast it on one of your allies, and for 10 turns, it gives them immunity to fear, as well as 5 temporary hit points every turn. You can also upcast it, and you can target one additional creature for every spell level that you upcast it with. So with a 4th level spellcast of Heroism, you can target your entire party. Heroism has some really interesting things going for it. 5 temp HP every turn is obviously not that much, but in fights that go long, this will add up to an enormous amount of hit points. If you were theoretically to end up in a fight that lasted for 10 turns and took at least 5 damage every turn, you would get 50 temp HP out of this spell, which is very good. But if you don't take any damage, then the temp HP that you get in subsequent turns is wasted, and in shorter combats, obviously, you're going to get significantly less value out of it. There's 2 main uses for Heroism. The first is at early levels. when fights are more likely to go long, you can put this on your main melee character. They'll be consistently taking damage, and it can act as a regeneration spell to keep them healed up throughout the fight. The second is at later levels, when there are encounters where you want fear immunity, you can use a 3rd or 4th level spell slot on this spell and give your whole party or anyone who's going to be hit by the fear effect immunity to that. And that can really give you some advantages in some otherwise fairly difficult encounters. There's a lot of ways to get fear immunity in the game, but Heroism is a pretty good one. It doesn't take any action. It gives you the extra healing value by giving you the extra temp HP. So if you need fear immunity, this is not a totally embarrassing way to do it. That being said, the value of this spell is still going to be fairly low in most encounters. You need a lot of conditions in order for Heroism to be good, because you need to be consistently taking damage, you need to not be using other sources of temporary hit points, because they won't stack, so you're going to lose a lot of value if you have a character who's using stuff like Armor of Agathis, or if you're using the item that gives you temp HP when you heal an ally, things like that. It also doesn't count as healing, so it doesn't trigger the on-heal effect. And you also need to have fear immunity be relevant. For fights where those things are all true, Heroism is a pretty good effect, but that describes a very small number of fights. I'll be honest and say that this is kind of a pet spell of mine. I think that this spell is a little bit underrated, in particular in the late game. Spending a 4th level spell slot on this before you have Hero's Feast online to get fear immunity for your whole party can solve some otherwise fairly difficult encounters. And you get a lot of hit point value out of it, so if you're a lower damage party setup, then you can use it. But from an objective standpoint, Heroism is only going to be valuable in a very small subset of encounters, so I'm going to give it C tier. I was kind of tempted to give it B tier because I actually really like this spell and think that it should be used a little more than it is, and a lot of people would have it in D tier, I think. But C tier, I think, given that its uses are pretty narrow, is very fair for Heroism. Next up, Hex. Hex is a warlock spell, costs a bonus action, and it uses your concentration. And you cast it on a target within 60 feet, and as long as you're concentrating on that spell, all of your attacks against that target do an extra 1d6 of necrotic damage. Counts for any time you roll an attack roll against the enemy. So if you hit them with a weapon, if you fire an Eldritch Blast at them, anything that rolls an attack roll is going to deal an extra d6 of damage with Hex. Doesn't work if they're making a saving throw, so a fireball won't do extra damage, but anything that rolls an attack will. This is especially good with effects that roll multiple attacks, like a Warlock's Eldritch Blast, which can fire up to 3 beams, or a Scorching Ray or something like that, because you get the extra 1d6 damage on every one of those individual attacks. For each attack roll that you make, you're going to get an extra d6 of damage with Hex. This can add up to a ton of damage. I've already talked about how with Guiding Bolt, 4d6 damage is a pretty reasonable ratio for a level 1 spell. Hex can do that in 1 turn if you use a hasted action to fire 2 Eldritch Blasts at level 5, and then continues to do additional damage as long as that enemy's hexed. And then when you kill the enemy, you get the ability to reapply the Hex. As long as you maintain concentration on it, you can spend another bonus action and no spell slot to hex a new creature. So basically, every single target that you fight for the entire day, because it lasts all day, you're going to be doing an extra d6 of damage on every attack against them, as long as you have a bonus action and don't lose concentration on the spell. This can add up to hundreds of damage over the course of longer adventuring days, even potentially thousands if you take really, really long adventuring days. And obviously for a level 1 spell, that's incredible value. Now, it's a warlock spell, so you're not just spending a level 1 spell slot on this. If you're a higher level warlock, then you're automatically upcasting it and maybe spending a much more valuable spell slot. But for a character who is multiclassed into Warlock, the level 1 Warlock spell is incredible, or if you have level 1 slots from multiclassing out of Warlock. And even for a Warlock with higher level options available, Hex is still an extremely efficient spell that does tons and tons of damage and is going to be very useful for increasing your damage output over the course of the day. Hex also has a secondary effect, which is that it gives the target disadvantage on ability checks with an ability of your choice. But importantly, this is ability checks, not things like attack rolls and saving throws, so skill checks. So you can make an enemy worse at picking a lock, but you can't make them worse at shooting a bow or dodging a fireball. Most of the time, you don't care about enemy skill checks at all. There's one relevant skill check that enemies will make, which is an athletics check. So almost always you're going to use Hex on strength to make enemies worse at shoving you around and worse at resisting being shoved. Sometimes you could use dexterity if you know they have higher acrobatics, but honestly, if you just always pick strength and never put any brain power into considering which ability you're going to use with Hex, you're going to be happier and better off. I would actually say that for me, this ability is mostly a downside because it makes the spell take an extra click to cast, which is much worse than the benefits of the spell, in my opinion. All that said, though, the extra damage that you get from Hex is absurd. I mean, it's a first level spell that can add up to 1,000 damage with just one spell slot. Obviously, that's over many, many encounters and everything, but the potential on this spell is really good. The actual effect in combat is great. It makes it much faster for you to kill high health enemies. It's better against bosses, because the tougher an enemy is, the more value you're going to get out of Hex. Just an incredible spell that does an enormous amount of damage. Pretty much every warlock is going to take this spell and use it constantly through the early game. You may replace this at later levels when your warlock levels have scaled up enough that you have access to lots of higher level spells and there's other stuff you want to concentrate on. But Hex is so much damage and is going to see so much use, it can't go anywhere other than S tier. Next up, Hunter's Mark. Hunter's Mark is the ranger version of Hex. It's mechanically identical, except for a couple small differences. Firstly, instead of working on every attack, it only works on weapon attacks, not unarmed strikes or spells. And secondly, instead of doing a d6 of necrotic damage, it does a d6 of the damage type of your weapon. That's mostly an advantage because often that damage type will be piercing, so you can use the Ballast Armor or the Bloodthirst Dagger in order to double the damage that this does in the late game. So mostly these mechanical differences don't matter. You're going to use it exactly the same way that a Warlock would use Hex to deal an extra 1d6 damage on all of your attacks. It also doesn't have the debuff on skill checks, but again, that mostly doesn't matter. Just like for Warlocks, Hex is incredible for Rangers, tons and tons of extra damage, and you're going to use it on every Ranger. Always happy to have this spell S tier. Next up, Ice Knife. Ice Knife is a damage spell. You target a creature within 60 feet and make an attack roll against them, and then if you hit, they take 1d10 piercing damage, and then whether you hit or miss, everything within 7 feet of the target, including the target itself, has to make a dexterity save or take 2d6 cold damage. If they pass the save, the 2d6 cold damage is completely negated. They don't take half on a failure. It also leaves behind an ice surface in that 7-foot radius, and we know already exactly how good ice surfaces are. We've talked a lot about that already. Ice Knife is very similar to casting Chromatic Orb for cold. It's a direct damage spell that leaves behind an ice surface, and that is a very powerful thing for a spell to be. It does a little bit more damage. Ice Knife does an average of 12.5 damage compared to cold Chromatic Orb's 9 damage, and does 19.5 damage if the enemy is wet compared to Chromatic Orb's 18 damage against a wet enemy. So it definitely has a slight edge in that it does more damage, but obviously you sacrifice all of the incredible versatility from Chromatic Orb. The question is the extra couple points of damage worth losing all the versatility from Chromatic Orb? And the answer is basically no. For wizards and sorcerers who get access to both Chromatic Orb and Ice Knife, you're almost always just going to use Chromatic Orb instead. However, this spell is also available to druids who don't get Chromatic Orb, and for druids this is just going to be a mainstay combat spell. Even a slightly worse version of Chromatic Orb is still an excellent non-concentration, control, and damage spell, so druids are going to be casting this all the time. A tier for Ice Knife, just going to be cast very frequently. Inflict Wounds. Inflict Wounds is a cleric damage spell. It's melee range, which is both good and bad for a damage spell. Bad, obviously, because it makes the targeting and positioning much more restrictive, because you can't use it on an enemy who's far away. But good because if an enemy has closed to melee with your cleric, you won't take disadvantage on the attack roll that you're making with Inflict Wounds. If you hit the target with it, they take 3d10 necrotic damage, which is 16.5 average damage. That's the highest average damage for a level 1 spell, unless you count things like Hex and Hunter's Mark, and is actually one of the highest damage actions available at first level. Compare this to a paladin with a smite attack. A paladin with a one-handed weapon, like a longsword, is going to do 7.5 weapon damage on average, plus 9 average damage from their smite for 16.5. So Inflict Wounds is basically like giving a cleric the ability to make a paladin smite using a first-level spell. That's still not as amazing as it sounds, because clerics will often have things that they want to do that they would rather do on their turn, things like casting command, and clerics obviously still don't want to be in melee as much as paladins do. They'll often be concentrating on something, so putting them in danger can be fairly risky, but Inflict Wounds does the damage to back up using the spell. It's a very good ratio of spell slot to damage output. It also has some uses at higher levels. You can upcast it, and it does an extra d10 of damage for every level that you upcast it, which is pretty powerful. You can also extend the range if you're multiclassed with Sorcerer and use Extended Inflict Wounds, which is a really solid ranged attack if you want to go that route. So there's some ways you can build around the spell. Most clerics are not going to be using Inflict Wounds that often, but in some cases where you just need an enemy dead, this is a great way to do it. So I'm going to give it B tier. If you're comparing this spell directly to Guiding Bolt, in general, I think Inflict Wounds is very slightly better now that Toll the Dead exists, so clerics have another ranged damage option. But both of these are just going to be solid spells that your clerics will use when appropriate, but not your usual go-to because you're going to be casting other spells like Command. Longstrider. Longstrider is a ritual spell, meaning that when cast outside of combat, it doesn't cost a spell slot, it lasts all day, doesn't require concentration, and gives the target plus 10 to their movement speed. That means, because of those features, that you can have it on every character in your party, on every summon in your party, and everything, all the time. You can use a character who stays at camp to cast this spell, or you can take it on a member of your active party, and either way, every single party member in Baldur's Gate should always have Longstrider at all times. 10 feet of extra movement speed completely for free is ridiculous. Mobility is one of the most important things in the game, and this gives it to you without any cost. Honestly, I could go on and on about how good this spell is, but the only thing that you really need to know is it lasts all day, it's free, and it's a huge bonus. S tier for Longstrider. If there was an S plus tier on this tier list, it would definitely go in that. Mage Armour. Mage Armour is another day-long buff, though it actually costs a spell slot, and how it works is you cast it on a character who's not wearing armor, and it changes their base armor class from 10 to 13. Every character has a base AC of 10 plus their dexterity modifier. With Mage Armour, that becomes 13 plus their dexterity modifier, as long as they're not wearing any other form of armor. You can use a shield with Mage Armour, just not any set of armor that has light, medium, or heavy in its item description, and that includes helmets and boots, so this only works if your character is completely in cloth. That's okay, because for the characters that want to use this spell, mostly sorcerers and wizards, there are a lot of good robes and cloth armor item sets, so those characters would probably be in robes anyways, and for them it's just plus 3 AC for free for the entire day, or for the very cheap cost of a level 1 spell slot. At low levels, you're almost certainly not going to be using Mage Armour significantly. Spending a level 1 spell slot on plus 3 AC is not an amazing trade. You would rather spend that spell slot on an offensive spell to end combat faster. And a lot of races in Baldur's Gate 3 have natural armor proficiencies. Gale, for example, is a human, so he can just wear light armor and have 13 AC without having to spend a spell slot. But at later levels, once you start getting powerful robes that would make you want to wear cloth armors anyways, Mage Armour becomes extremely valuable. So at low levels, you're not going to cast this spell, but at higher levels, it's going to be a basically mandatory part of the setup for almost any character that is going unarmored. For that reason, I'm going to give it A tier, because it has very low impact on the most dangerous part of the game, the early game, when you're not going to use it. But in the late game, this spell is extremely helpful, just a powerful bonus that you can get at the cost of a spell that lasts all day. It's also worth noting that this spell persists even if the character leaves your party, so you can have a character stay at camp and cast this on your wizard, and then you get it for free, which is obviously more powerful when you get something for free, but if cast from your active party, this is still a very powerful spell. Magic Missile. Magic Missile fires 3 missiles at targets within 60 feet. You can split these up over 3 different targets, or target them all at the same creature. And each missile does 1d4 plus 1 force damage. Force damage is a good damage type, almost nothing resists it. And the important thing about Magic Missile is that it just always works. The only way to block a Magic Missile is with the shield spell. Otherwise, it can't miss. It will always hit its target, and it goes around corners. It doesn't care about line of sight. So as long as the enemy is within 60 feet, you can target them with Magic Missile, and they will take damage. Guaranteed damage is excellent, and being able to split that up across multiple low health enemies to finish them off is very powerful. There's a lot of fights where you just need a little bit of damage on a few different targets spread around the battlefield, and Magic Missile does that excellently. What's more, it's multiple damage instances, so it combines very, very well with any effect that adds extra damage anytime you hit an enemy. Things like the Callous Glow Ring add 2 damage per missile. Lightning charges from the Spell Sparkler build up on each missile, so you're going to get significant additional damage there. Shriek from Falara Louv, Hexblade's Curse. There's lots of ways to increase your damage per missile. And if you check out my one-shot kills without dice build, I go into how you can build Magic Missile up to the point where it just one-shot kills with 100% accuracy every single enemy in the game. Even if you're not building around the spell, though, to just one-shot everything, it's still an incredible spell. Guaranteed damage, no questions asked, that goes around corners, that doesn't care where your enemies are or what they're doing, is just incredibly versatile and incredibly powerful. And when you take into account the additional synergies that you get, this spell is just even better. There's almost nothing that you just can't do with Magic Missile. It can be your mainstay combat spell. It can be a utility spell to win certain encounters. It can be used only as backup to finish off low health enemies. But no matter what, pretty much every party is going to want Magic Missile because the number of times where you just need a little bit of damage on an enemy are incredibly high. It also has a really strong synergy with the Cull the Weak Illithid power. If an enemy is at low health, you can Magic Missile, get them below the Cull the Weak threshold, and then pop a bunch of enemies with Cull the Weak. So there are tons and tons of applications and synergies, but even at base, the spell is just excellent because it always works. The enemy of optimization is randomness, and Magic Missile is the least random thing in the game, S tier. Protection from Evil and Good. Protection from Evil and Good is a long rest buff spell, that requires your concentration. So you target an ally, and until you long rest or until you drop concentration on the spell, they get a protection effect against certain kinds of creatures. The creatures this works against are aberrations, celestials, elementals, fae, fiends, and undead, which do represent a fair subset of the encounters in Baldur's Gate. In particular, aberrations and undead are very common in Baldur's Gate 3, so protection from evil and good actually works in a lot more encounters than you might think that it would. What the buff that it gives you against these enemies is they all get disadvantage on their attack rolls against you. That's pretty powerful. Concentration-based buff that gives your main the character who's going to be taking the most attacks, gives enemies disadvantage against them, is going to prevent a decent amount of damage in the encounters where it's relevant, and on a day where you're going to be taking mostly fights against this type of creature, that can be a pretty powerful buff. The main downside is that it conflicts with your concentration, and a lot of characters that get access to this spell will want to be concentrating on something else. In addition to that effect, protection from evil and good also has a secondary effect, which is that it makes the target immune to frightened. That's not what the tooltip says, but the tooltip is wrong. The tooltip says that it makes the target immune to charmed, frightened, and possession by the listed creatures, but it actually does nothing against charm and prevents frightened from everything, not just the creatures that it's supposed to work against. So basically you can think of it as immunity to frightened, and all of those types of creatures get disadvantage on their attack rolls against you. That's a pretty solid buff. It's not going to work in every combat, obviously, but in the combats where it will work, it's pretty good. Giving all enemies disadvantage on attacks against you in a given fight can be pretty solid. And immunity to Frightened is also a pretty relevant status, though in general I think you're going to be better off if you want to get this from a concentration source, using Heroism, or using, at later levels, things like Hero's Feast in order to get Fear immunity. All that said, even in the encounters where you can use this spell, it's often going to be better to use your concentration on something more proactive and powerful, so even when this spell is usable, it's still not often going to be the best thing that you can do. I'm going to give it C tier because it does have uses in some encounters, but a lot of the time you're going to prefer to do something else. Next up, Ray of Sickness. Ray of Sickness is a damage spell. 60-foot range attack roll, and if you hit, they take 2d8 poison damage, which is a very small amount of damage for a level 1 spell, and poison damage is the worst damage type in the game, like half the enemies in the game are resistant or immune to poison. They also, if they're not immune to poison, have to make a Constitution save or become poisoned for 2 turns, which gives them disadvantage on attack rolls. This is a pretty small debuff, and a lot of the enemies that you would want to get this debuff on will have really good Constitution saves. Constitution in general is the worst save to target because enemies will tend to have pretty high Constitution saves, and in particular, characters who you want to give disadvantage on their attack rolls will often have very good con saves. So it's a damage spell that doesn't really do damage, a debuff spell that's unreliable with a bad debuff. This spell is just not good. Don't waste your time. D tier. Sanctuary. Sanctuary is a cleric spell. It's a bonus action that lasts for 10 turns and does not require your concentration. While a character is in Sanctuary, enemies cannot directly target them with attacks. They can still be caught in AoE attacks, but they can't be targeted by enemies for direct attacks. The Sanctuary will break if the creature inside of it harms another character, so does damage or causes a negative condition. So you can't attack from Sanctuary and you can't debuff from Sanctuary, but you can safely heal and buff your allies, maintain concentration on spells that have already been put in place. So if you lock down an enemy using a debuffing spell that doesn't do damage and then Sanctuary that character, they will not be able to be attacked and thus won't lose concentration on the spell. This is one of the most versatile and powerful spells in the entire game. It's only a bonus action, and it can prevent enemy turns entirely. If they were mostly going to attack one character, sanctuarying that character will prevent the enemies from acting. It can be used to operate in perfect safety while healing and buffing your allies, or maintaining concentration on powerful spells like Haste. You can haste your allies, or twin haste with a sorcerer, then put Sanctuary on that sorcerer, and then they will maintain concentration on that haste, basically for free. Well, you do have to be a little bit careful around AoE damage, because you can still be hurt in Sanctuary, you just can't be attacked. This spell gives you so much flexibility and so much invulnerability that it is just one of the most powerful spells in the game. Not only is the default use of just sitting your healer or haste bot in Sanctuary just incredible, you can also use this in tremendously creative ways. You can block a doorway with a completely immune character with it. You can use it to cluster enemies around you. If they can only see the Sanctuary character, they'll cluster around them and then move that character away and then drop a fireball on those enemies. Minor Illusion is better for this, but if the character's already Sanctuaried, then why not? There are tons and tons of other effects. You can also just use it to save a low health ally who you want out of the fight, to make sure that they don't go down. You can use it on a character who is suddenly in danger in order to keep them alive. The uses both proactively and reactively for this spell are incredible. I could just keep going on and on about the uses for this spell, but Sanctuary is just absurdly valuable, and it's one of the best tools for getting out of bad situations and making good situations better. S tier. Searing Smite. Searing Smite is a paladin spell. It's one of their special smite attacks, but as a spell, it has some slight differences from the normal divine smite that paladins can just always use. You make it as part of a weapon attack, but it also requires your bonus action. So unlike normal Divine Smite, you have to both make the attack and spend a bonus action. You can also use this alongside a normal Divine Smite attack. So you could do both Divine Smite and Searing, Thunderous, or Wrathful Smite in the same turn. Searing Smite in particular requires your bonus action, your concentration, and a level 1 spell slot to do an extra 1d6 of fire damage, and then the enemy has to make a constitution save, and if they fail, they take an extra 1d6 of fire damage every turn, for 10 turns, as long as you maintain concentration on the spell. Each turn, they get a new constitution save in order to end this effect. Let's compare this to just the default Divine Smite. If you spend a level 1 spell slot on Divine Smite, you get 9 damage up front. Spend it on Searing Smite, you get 3.5 damage up front, and then if the enemy fails the save, you get another 3.5 damage next turn, and then if they fail the save again, you get another 3.5 damage. So not only does it do less damage than Divine Smite, it also delays the damage compared to just using this spell slot on Divine Smite. If the other special smites didn't exist, this might have some usage because you could still do both Divine Smite and Searing Smite in the same turn, but it's also just worse than the other special smites. There is no reason to cast Searing Smite. It's the worst of the smite spells by far, D tier. The only use for this spell is if you get it for free as a Zariel Tiefling, not as a Paladin, because then it obviously doesn't cost you anything to use, so they'll still use it, but Paladins should never cast this spell. Shield. In the 2 years that I've been doing Baldur's Gate 3 build guides, I've probably talked more about this spell than pretty much any other feature of the game at all. Shield is an incredible defensive reaction. The way that it works is when an enemy attacks you, you can cast Shield and increase your armor class by 5 until the beginning of your next turn. The game will only prompt you to do this if it would turn a hit into a miss from an enemy. So every time you're using Shield, you're always negating at least one enemy attack. But then you also keep the +5 AC bonus for the rest of the turn. So future attacks from that enemy or other enemies are also more likely to miss. You can also use this to block Magic Missile. It makes you completely immune to Magic Missile. And some enemies in the game do cast that, so that will come up very occasionally, but the vast majority of times that you're using this, it's going to be to turn a dangerous enemy weapon attack into a missed attack. Turning a hit into a miss as a reaction is incredible. You're spending none of your turn, because you're using your reaction, to negate often the enemy's entire turn, or maybe even multiple turns from enemies if they then are not able to hit your newly higher AC. This is really good on characters with low AC. Enemies will preferentially target them, and then you can trick them by turning those hits into misses, and then suddenly your squishy wizard or whatever is now really hard to hit. Really good on characters with high AC, because it turns your already difficult to hit armor class into nearly impossible for enemies to hit. Shield won't stop critical hits, but for most characters, if you have decent AC, it's going to turn pretty much any attack that you want an enemy to miss into a miss, because your AC should be high enough that it's within 5 of them missing on most normal attack rolls that they make. So this spell is going to save you tens of thousands of points of damage across a playthrough. The number of additional hit points, actions that you get because your characters stay alive, actions that your enemies lose because they are missing attacks that they thought they were going to hit. It also works against spells with attack rolls, so they may be even burning resources in order to now miss with an attack that costs them a high level spell slot. Shield is just a ridiculous spell. Any character that can have access to this spell should try to, and it's often worth dipping into a class that gets Shield pretty much just for this spell. S tier for Shield. It's even better now that Hexblade exists, because you can get it on basically everyone for more or less free, because Hexblade is so strong. Just, again, one of the very strongest effects in the game. Shield of Faith. Shield of Faith is a concentration day-long buff, so it lasts until you lose concentration on it, and it gives the target +2 to their armor class. Unlike Mage Armour, it doesn't have any requirements. It will always work no matter what armor the creature is wearing. The only thing it doesn't stack with is more copies of Shield of Faith. +2 to your AC is a small but very relevant buff that most characters would be pretty happy to have. The main downside of Shield of Faith is just the opportunity cost. Because it takes your concentration, a lot of characters will not want to be using Shield of Faith because they have more important things to concentrate on. As a cleric and paladin spell, clerics will usually want to be concentrating on Bless at low levels, and on Spirit Guardians at high levels, and may have other utility spells like Protection from Evil that they want to concentrate on in certain encounters. So just using your concentration on Shield of Faith all day may not be the best for a cleric. For a paladin, it's a little more attractive. Paladins are less likely to drop concentration on spells because they have good saving throws and good armor class. They can cast Shield of Faith on themselves in order to make an even more defensive paladin. And one nice thing about this spell is it increases your AC. So if you cast it on yourself, you're less likely to drop concentration on it because you're less likely to take damage. So it protects itself a little bit, unlike most other concentration spells. The real use of this spell, though, is for characters who have a 1-level dip in Cleric. Something like a Fighter or Ranger with a 1-level Cleric dip can use Shield of Faith and just concentrate on it all day for a nice bonus. And those characters can make pretty solid use of this spell, and a lot of the time they want to be concentrating on something anyways. Maybe they're using the Strange Conduit Ring that gives you extra damage on concentration when you're concentrating on something. Shield of Faith is a great way to trigger that while also getting a pretty useful bonus. For the characters that actually get this spell, Clerics and Paladins, this is less exciting. Clerics in particular won't usually want to be concentrating on this spell, but for characters that have 1-level dips in Cleric, this is very good. So while it's not for everybody, it's solid for certain builds, and I'm going to give it B tier. Next up, Sleep. Sleep is a debuffing spell, and it's one without a saving throw, which makes it always worth looking at. It actually works a little bit differently than almost any other spell in the game. You target creatures, and it affects them based on their total HP. So it will affect up to 24 total hit points of creatures and put them to sleep. So if you hit 3 8 HP characters with it, all 3 of them will fall asleep. Hit 2 10 HP characters, they'll both fall asleep. Hit 1 20 HP enemy, it'll fall asleep, but hit a 30 HP enemy and it does nothing. Putting an enemy to sleep prevents them from acting at all, which obviously is incredibly powerful, and it has no saving throw, so as long as enemies are below the hit point total, sleep will always work, which makes it extremely strong at low levels. The problem for this spell is that enemy hit point totals pretty quickly outscale 24 total hit points. On higher difficulties, enemies have pretty solid hit point values, and very quickly, once you hit level 3 or so, you're going to find that even weak enemies will have enough hit points that you'll only get 1, maybe maximum 2 of them with sleep. And if you don't get a lot of enemies in an encounter, they will wake each other up. Characters can be woken from sleep with a bonus action shove, and the AI will do this. So if you don't catch a lot of enemies with the sleep, then it will more or less not do anything, because they'll just wake each other up and then act normally. But at low levels, when you can catch a big chunk of an encounter with sleep, it's extremely powerful. You can also upcast it. You get 8 more hit points worth of enemies per level that you upcast it, which can let you hit higher level enemies even later into the game. And of course, as you damage, kill, and lower enemy HP, you can target more and more powerful enemies with sleep just because you've done a little bit of damage to them. So even later on it can be relevant, but mostly this spell is a very early game spell. But for the first 3 levels, this spell is incredible. No save, complete disable on half or even an entire encounter is awesome. So for the first 3 levels, this spell is an all-star. After that point, you're going to swap it out. For that reason, it's a little bit hard to rate. I'm going to give it B tier because it's so good at the beginning of the game, which is also the most important part of the game. But then later on falls off a cliff completely, so you're going to swap out of this spell for almost every character that takes it. But in the early game, it'll be excellent. Speak with Animals. Speak with Animals is a ritual spell, so it doesn't cost a spell slot, and it lasts all day, so it's free, and it lets you talk with animals. There's a surprising number of animals in the game that you can have conversations with, and a lot of the time this will let you bypass skill checks in order to achieve something, so some quests you can get, some bonuses or treasures and things like that you can get without having to roll a skill check if you can talk with an animal. So it does have some reasonable mechanical benefits when it comes to gaining power and winning the game. Aside from that, it's also just really fun because you can talk with animals, and that's just great to do. So I personally will never play a party that doesn't have access to this effect in some way. That in some way is fairly load-bearing here, though, because the actual Speak with Animals spell mostly isn't necessary. The game will shower you with Speak with Animal potions, especially in the early game. You're just going to get so many potions of animal speaking that you can talk to every animal in the game using a potion and never cast this spell once pretty easily without ever buying or stockpiling or worrying about acquiring them. Because the game really wants you to be able to, see that content. So it makes it very easy for you to do that. For that reason, Speak with Animals mostly just saves you like a little bit of gold in some circumstances and a little bit of clicking and inventory management, which I personally find worthwhile. But from a mechanical standpoint, the extreme prevalence of Speak with Animals potions makes actually taking the spell somewhat redundant. I'm going to give it C tier because it is a real benefit and talking with animals is useful, but the game will give you so many sources of this for free that you mostly don't need to actually take the spell. Tasha's Hideous Laughter. Tasha's Hideous Laughter is a concentration-based single-target control spell. Target an enemy, and they have to make a wisdom saving throw, which if they fail, they fall prone and immediately start laughing, becoming completely incapacitated. So very similar to Command, it's a wisdom save, or the enemy is just out of the fight. It lasts for 10 turns or until you drop concentration, but each of those 10 turns, the enemy gets an additional wisdom save to try to break out of it. And every time you damage them, they also get another wisdom save to try to break out of it. So in the early game, before your save DCs are really high, this will be fairly unreliable. Whenever you damage the enemy, they're going to get a chance to snap out of it, and they often will. In the late game, once you've stacked up a lot of save DC gear and enemies are less likely to succeed on their saving throws, Tasha's Hideous Laughter is just 10 turns of full disable. It's especially useful on Honor Mode because a lot of bosses have immunity to incapacitation effects, but for whatever reason, no immunity to Tasha's Hideous Laughter. So a lot of enemies that are immune to tons and tons of other sources of crowd control, you can still hit with this, and it takes them out of the fight completely. You can just drop some of the strongest enemies in the game and watch them helplessly lying there laughing on the ground while you finish them off at your leisure, especially if your save DCs are high enough that they can't pass the saving throw. It obviously excellent, especially because it's an enchantment spell with Arcane Acuity, Band of the Mystic Scoundrel casters, but even any other spellcaster with high spell save DCs can use Tasha's Hideous Laughter to win some of the most dangerous late game encounters. So in the early game, this spell is usually fairly safe to skip. You will not get a ton of value out of it early on when enemies can more easily break out of the save. Once you've stacked up a lot of save DC gear, this is very powerful. It's a little worse than some other crowd control options, but it works on so many more things that you should usually have this spell on a character that can cast it, so I'm going to give it A tier. Thunderous Smite. Thunderous Smite is another one of the Paladin Smite spells, just like Searing Smite. So you make it as part of an attack, it takes your bonus action, although unlike Searing Smite, not your concentration. And it does 2d6 of thunder damage, and then enemies have to make a strength save, and if they fail the save, they're knocked 10 feet backwards and fall prone. Knocking an enemy backwards and knocking them prone is pretty powerful, and as a strength save, it often will succeed against the types of enemies that you want to knock prone. This is especially good against casters who are concentrating on spells, because if you knock them prone, they immediately lose concentration on their spell. So when you compare this to a normal Divine Smite for 2d8 radiant damage, Thunderous Smite is often going to compare favorably. Doing 2 less average damage in exchange for knocking enemies prone and immediately breaking concentration, maybe knocking them off a cliff, that's often going to be a trade that you're going to want to make. So even if you compare Divine Smite and Thunderous Smite directly, Thunderous Smite will often win. However, you don't have to choose. You can use Divine Smite and Thunderous Smite both in the same turn. It costs 2 spell slots, whatever level you made the Smite attack at, plus Thunderous Smite, so it can be very expensive in terms of resources. But if you really need an enemy dead, spending 2 Smites on the same attack can guarantee kill that enemy by doing tons and tons of damage. So it not only does it provide crowd control as an alternative to Divine Smite, it also provides burst damage on top of Divine Smite, and is the best of the Paladin Smite spells at doing that. For that reason, Thunderous Smite is a spell that almost every paladin is going to take, and you're going to use it pretty frequently, so I'm going to give it A tier. You will often use it instead of Divine Smites or in addition to Divine Smites because it is comparable damage with a nice bonus effect. Thunderwave. Thunderwave is kind of a defensive damage spell. It's available to bards, druids, sorcerers, and wizards, and it's cast in a 17-foot cube, so actually a square. The tooltip says cube, but like almost every other AoE spell in Baldur's Gate, it completely ignores the vertical axis. So it's a 17 by 17 square next to the caster. If you enemies caught in it take 2d8 thunder damage with a Constitution saving throw for half, and if they fail the save, they are flung 27 feet backwards, so almost 30 feet straight backwards. Which is, of course, going to buy you a lot of space. You can use this to push melee enemies away and then run away from them, and you can use it to push enemies off of cliffs or into hazardous effects. So this is a pretty solid panic button spell if your caster is starting to get surrounded. And it's also a good way to take advantage of cliff faces and ground targeting effects that you might have on the ground. You can use Thunderwave to push a bunch of enemies into it. The targeting on this spell is pretty awkward. A 17-foot square is smaller than it sounds and somewhat hard to hit more than like 2 enemies with it in most cases. But if you do hit 2 enemies, then the damage is okay. If it's, 2d8 thunder spread across 2 enemies, then that's a pretty solid damage output. Though a con save for half means that a lot of enemies are going to succeed on the save. The real thing that is holding this spell back is that it's a Constitution save, and the enemies that you most want to push, i.e. things like fighters and barbarians that are getting up close to your casters, are going to be really good at resisting it, and if you cast this spell and just do a small amount of damage and then can't leave melee range and run away, it gets you in a lot of trouble. This spell certainly won't be used every encounter, but it's definitely solid enough that you'll use it some of the time, so I'm going to give it B tier. Witch Bolt. Witch Bolt is an attack-targeted damage spell, so you make an attack roll, and if you hit, the enemy takes a d12 of lightning damage. You can then concentrate on the spell, and each turn, for up to 10 turns, you can spend your action to reactivate it, again dealing a d12 of lightning damage. This is pretty bad for a first-level spell. A d12 of lightning damage is an embarrassing amount of damage for a spell. And the ability to waste your turn over and over, and also your concentration, does not particularly make this spell more attractive. At first level, this is just a damage spell that simply does not do enough damage to ever be worth casting. However, this spell does have one distinction, which is that because it gains a d12 of damage for each level that you upcast it, it is the best spell for one specific build. You can find my build video called The One-Shot Lightning Lord, which makes use of Witch Bolt. When you're using a 4th level or higher spell slot and maximizing the damage with Tempest Cleric, doubling the damage with Wet, and getting automatic critical hits because it's an attack roll, Witch Bolt is the highest damage spell in the game. So you can use this spell to deal guaranteed damage in the mid 300s with that specific build. But outside of that one abusive use case, Witch Bolt is useless. I'm going to give it C tier because there's one build where you use it, and the rest of the time you should never cast this spell. And finally, the last of the first level spells, Wrathful Smite. Wrathful Smite is another Paladin Smite, although as of patch 8, it is now also available to Hexblade Warlocks who get it at level 1. It's a weapon attack that does an extra 1d6 psychic damage, and requires your bonus action and concentration to use alongside the weapon attack, and then also enemies have to make a wisdom save or they become frightened for 2 turns. Now, frightening an enemy is a pretty good debuff. It gives them disadvantage on attack rolls and prevents them from moving. And while it's a little worse to frighten an enemy in melee range with your Hexblade or Paladin than it would be to frighten them at range, where you can stop melee enemies from attacking you, you're still not usually sad to have an enemy immobilized next to a dangerous melee attacker like a Paladin or Hexblade. Wrathful Smite therefore does have some uses. When you want to lock down a character that you suspect is trying to get away, Wrathful Smite is pretty good. While it's much lower damage than Thunderous Smite, doing only 1d6 instead of 2d6, and without the potential of punting an enemy off a cliff for even more damage, the debuff on Wrathful Smite is actually really good, so you're still going to use this sometime. sometimes. Paladins will use this, I think, a little more than Hexblades, just because Hexblade's spell list is so good, and there are other first level spells that you really are going to want. Things like Hex and Shield are going to be basically mandatory for Hexblades. But for Paladins, having access to Wrathful Smite definitely gives you more options for how you fight in combat, and being able to frighten and thus keep an enemy next to you will definitely come up. I'm going to give it B tier. You're going to use it a lot less than Thunderous Smite, but when you do, it's going to be very solid. Alright, my friends, that is all 52 of the first level spells rated. I guess your homework, because there's 52 of them, is let me know which spells correspond to which card in a deck of playing cards, in your opinion. One thing that should be pretty clear looking at this spell list is that first level spells are not used for damage primarily. The best first level spells are buffs, crowd control, especially repeatable crowd control, and utility spells. But mostly the damage available at this level is not very high, and we're going to get our first really strong damage spells starting at spell level 2. The best first level spells also stay powerful throughout the game and upcast well, so you're going to be looking for spells that you can spend higher level spell slots on. And something that's going to be important to keep in mind as we look at higher level spells is that they are always competing against first level spells. So the higher a spell level we get, the more spells it's competing against. So you're probably going to see fewer and fewer S tier spells as we climb the tier list, because every subsequent spell level is competing against first level spells. As always, of course, if you've enjoyed this video, definitely leave a comment. And if you think there's anything that I should move around on this tier list, definitely leave a comment and give me your reasoning for that as well. I'm very open to moving things around. If you compare this to my previous first level spells tier list, you can see, I think almost half of the spells have changed tier, either because the game has changed or my opinion has changed. So, if you have good reasons that you think I should move any of these spells to another tier, definitely do let me know. I'm very open to that. I will also zoom in and take the cursor off the list, so if you're looking to get a clean screenshot, then you can do that. So go ahead and do that now. And of course, thank you so much for watching. Leave a comment, hit like for the algorithm. I appreciate you taking the time to do that. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for future spell tier lists for the other 5 spell levels, and other Baldur's Gate 3 build guides, and other strategy game analysis. Cheers, friends. I'll catch you next time.